In Unit 2, we're going to be looking at classroom management as the backbone of discipline. Have you ever noticed that while some classes seem to be overrun with discipline problems, some classrooms seem to have very little? And this doesn't just happen by accident. A well-managed classroom has a minimum of discipline issues because the teacher has done a tremendous job of intentionally preventing them. Now, there are 3 important areas that teachers need to manage in their classrooms to avoid or minimize disruptions. And the first is your classroom layout, how you design and set up your classroom. Secondly, it's routines. And this refers to the different routines and procedures that you put in place and also how you're going to enforce these routines in your classroom. And lastly, we're going to look at your teaching, how your lessons are prepared and how they are carried out. So let's take a look at classroom layout. On your screen, there are 3 different layouts, and each layout will influence what teaching style you're going to use, such as rows will lend itself to a more teacher-centered style of teaching, while small groups lend themselves to more learner-centered style of teaching. Are you going to stand up and do all the talking, or do you want the learners to be more interactive and hands-on in their lesson? Your layout will also determine what sort of interaction that you want learners to have. Will they work on their own predominantly, or do you prefer learners to work in pairs or small groups? Remember, if you choose a teacher-centered approach where you do all the talking, you might feel that learners seated in rows offers fewer distractions. However, learners sometimes become bored, and boredom leads to disruptions. More importantly, you need to choose a layout where you can easily observe and monitor your learners, and you need to have good and easy access to them as well. And that brings us to our last point. You need to determine where your congestion areas are going to be in your classroom and facilitate how learners are going to move through these areas. And by congestion areas, I'm talking about the dustbin, where learners all want to congregate and sharpen their pencil at the same time, or perhaps where learners put their bags, or where they hand in work or collect work from. You need to make this as smooth as possible to ensure that fewer disruptions occur. If you would like to learn more about classroom management, you should look at our Classroom Management Managing Your Environment course, where you will look into this topic in more depth and explore different classroom layouts and the pros and cons of each. Now, routines and procedures are the backbone that supports your discipline structure in your classroom. Routines demonstrate to learners what exactly is expected of them, such as when the bell rings and they come to class, they could all run and fight each other to get through the door first, or they can be taught a routine where they line up behind each other against the wall and wait quietly until the teacher welcomes them inside. That way, they know what is expected of them when the bell rings. So a teacher's day is full of many distractions. And this starts from greeting your class, handing in your homework diaries, handing out work, handing the books in, getting changed for phys ed, doing reading on the mat, or working in groups. And this is all done before first break. When learners do know exactly what is expected of them, less chaos erupts. The more consistent and clearly visible your daily routines are, the more safely and smoothly and cooperatively your classroom will run. The next crucial element to look at is your teaching. Sometimes teachers need to be honest and look at their own lessons. Most of the time, learners become disruptive because they are bored. When planning your lessons, you need to keep the following in mind. Your number 1 is you need to keep your learners interested and busy. Every lesson should have a hook. Something that is going to grip the learners and make them interested in what you are teaching them. To do this, you might need to find out what your learners like or what their interests are to try and relate the topic or content to them. You also need to differentiate your lessons. Try different teaching styles to keep the learners interested. You also need to remember to extend and support learners. And this is very important because learners who don't feel confident in the work or feel they have the ability to complete the work might become disruptive to distract from their feelings that they have towards the work. And on the flip side, learners who go through the work really quickly become bored because they're finished, and then they might become disruptive because they really don't have anything to do. So when you're planning a lesson, make sure you've got some activities that you can possibly break up into smaller chunks or easier chunks for learners who are struggling, and make sure you've got work to extend and keep learners busy for the learners who finish early. Secondly, you need variety. You need to change or mix up the way that you teach. Not necessarily every single lesson, but try and differentiate your teaching styles from time to time to keep the learners interested. Allow them to possibly study a section and teach the class themselves, or to summarize a section and then collate all the summaries to make one note. Always try to keep learners interested in the lesson and what you are teaching them, and then they won't have time to become disruptive. If you find that learners are becoming restless or losing concentration, then perhaps try a brain break. Now, these are short activities that you can get learners moving to get rid of some energy before continuing. And a brain break could be a simple activity such as take off one shoe, throw it in a pile, and then mix them all up, and then they've got 3 minutes to quickly find their shoe and sit down. But make sure all the shoes are labeled. And lastly, you need to plan for disruptions. If you know your learners need to get up and get their textbooks, ensure that they know how to do it and what is expected of them, and then they will behave appropriately. If they are working in groups, then again, reinforce and communicate how you expect your learners to behave in groups.